Well, thank you for quieting down. My name's Roger Ream. I'm president of the Fund for American Studies. It's our great pleasure to co-sponsor, in a sense, this program with the Office of Senator Rand Paul, with the support of the Einhorn Family Foundation, Steve and Nancy Einhorn, who are generously supporting to cover the costs of everything from our promotion to the lunch you'll have today. And if you don't have if you have any questions about lunch, see our staff on your way out. Today we've got a great program. I missed last week. You heard from Senator Rand Paul. Hopefully most of you were here. I heard great reports on that, and I watched it online. Today we have another outstanding speaker who Senator Paul will introduce in just a minute. I want to say our next lecture will be July 13th. We'll have some very esteemed people from the medical profession talking about the whole range of issues around COVID and the pandemic. So you won't want to miss that, July 13th at 12:30, and you'll get details in your email. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who doesn't need an introduction to this group. Senator Paul.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's great. We are excited to have Professor Johnathan Turley from George Washington University. He's one of, I think, the foremost constitutional experts that you'll see. I understand he's the second most quoted person on the internet. Who's the first person on constitutional law? Maybe he'll tell us who the first person is. But he is, I think, a great voice. I follow him on Twitter. I think it's definitely worth following him on Twitter and listening to what he has to say about the issues of the day. He's had many famous clients, but the one that intrigued me the most is he defended people from Area 51. Now, I'm not sure if they were human or alien or if he's allowed to reveal who he represented, but he represented somebody from Area 51. But no, he's been involved with a lot of famous cases around the country, and like I say, one of the leading conservative constitutional analysts around, Professor Johnathan Turley.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. And thank you for coming out to see me, and thank you, Senator. It is always an honor to be with you. And thank you very much for the sponsorship of this wonderful program. We're really going to talk today about the Supreme Court, which is a topic close to my heart. We selected this topic before any of the recent news broke, involving the leak and, of course, the protests, etc. And the last few months have been very, very difficult for everyone in the court, but also all of us who follow it as an institution and support its critical role in our constitutional system. In many ways, what we've seen in the last few weeks particularly is a crisis of faith. That you see that a people that has lost its faith in a constitutional system. That's what happens when you see these voices of violence, these faces of rage. And we don't want to admit it on the left or the right, but we've become a nation addicted to rage. And it is a fact that is inescapable that people enjoy rage. It can be an addiction. And the question is, what will the damage be, not just to us as a people from this period, but also to the institution of the Supreme Court? This is a defining moment for the court. In Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton was trying to sell the constitutional system, and when in referring to Article 3, referred to the courts as the least dangerous branch. And in some ways it was a useful spin, because you had people like Mason and others who were not particularly comfortable with this centralization of power. The interesting thing, though, is that if you read through the Constitution, I know all of you do that every night, the same as Senator Paul does. He goes to sleep reading it, largely stopping at Article 1. And if you go through the first three articles, you will be struck by a sort of interesting anomaly, right? Article 1 is incredibly detailed. It's really interesting. I'm a Madisonian scholar, so anything Madison does is like Elvis to me. But Article 1 is a really nice piece of work. Article 2 is pretty good. Then you get to Article 3, and it's almost like whatever. You know, it's so comparatively short. And for that reason, brilliant minds like Mason immediately went, whoa, what the heck is this thing? What is this function? And of course, we didn't really know. You know, that's what Marbury versus Madison was. But the problem is that Marbury versus Madison was itself a bit of a noble lie. When Marshall said that the Constitution dictates that we're the final arbiter of the law, that was not so clear. I am fairly confident all of us channel the framers. I alone speak for Madison, but other people will channel the other ones, the lesser ones. But I'm pretty confident if you ask the framers what they thought they were getting in Article 3, they probably would not have said Marbury versus Madison, because they would probably have assumed that our courts would function like England, where the Parliament actually could help redefine, reinterpret the law. So my guess is that if we actually did a push poll on the framers, they would have come out not saying that the court was the final arbiter. Now, the interesting thing about this is I think that Marshall got it right on the merits, that is perished the thought that Madison ever left anything out. Article 3 could have been a little better. And I think that Marbury versus Madison did make it better. We did need a final arbiter on the law. We did need an institution that would finally throw the flag on the play. Not that they're right? It's the famous Jackson statement that we're not final because we're infallible. We're infallible because we're final. And we do need finality. But the court is not some hothouse flower. It has had a long history of attacks and controversies. The first justice was not Marshall. John Jay was actually subject to a huge number of protests because of the Jay Treaty. Everyone hated the Jay Treaty. And there was an editorial when when the treaty came out that said, John Jay, the arch traitor, seize him, drown him, flay him alive. That was the largest newspaper in Washington. An editorial, crowds also, by the way, burned him in effigy, including a Kentucky mob. You go Kentucky. That went to, now this is truly a Kentucky moment, because other states could just burn you in effigy, but that's not right for Kentucky. In Kentucky, they stuffed Jay's effigy with gunpowder, guillotined it, and then blew it up. Okay, and so I think we can all agree that's authentically Kentucky. Jay commented later that you could cross the country at night by the light of my burning effigies. So the court was actually born in bad times. And actually one of the things that I often say when I speak to Congress is that they often suggest that the Constitution is not up to some task because we're living in bad times. And I always remind them the Constitution was written for bad times, not good times. And it was written during the worst of times. So when you talk about people talking like they want to kill each other today, they were actually trying to kill each other back then. That's what the Alien and Sedition Acts were, right? They were trying to arrest and kill opposing views and personalities. So you had a court that was ready for action. In fact, the one that was most ready was probably Stephen Field. You wouldn't have wanted to go picketing his house. He was actually an accomplished duelist. In 1863. He studied law, went to the gold rush, and then killed a man in a duel. So my guess is you really wouldn't want to mess with him. We also had justices, by the way, only one recorded case of justices actually trying to kill each other, which is pretty remarkable. And it actually didn't occur during service. It was actually during the Civil War that, John Marshall Harlan was at a dinner, supposedly, talking about the Civil War. He commanded a Zouave unit, which was sort of like almost like a special forces unit. It was like these guys they dressed like they were Turkish, what we thought Turkish soldiers dressed like, because everything Turkish back then was really in. And so these guys would dress in these sort of colorful pantaloons, but they were actually more trained than most soldiers. And so he took a command of a Zouave, and they were chasing a Confederate wagon train, and it got stuck in the river. And this private rides in the middle of the river as they're trying to get the last wagon out, and he's firing at Harlan, who's up on a bluff. And Harlan turns to his Zouave and says, "Shoot that man. Shoot him." And they're all shooting, and they're not hitting him. So he's at dinner later as a Supreme Court justice saying, "Wow, that was one lucky Confederate." And Justice Lurton said, "That would have been me. I got a medal for that engagement." And so that's the only known case of two justices actually trying to kill each other. The justices themselves have gotten past the duelist stage, and they are remarkably civil. And to her great credit, even though Justice Sotomayor can have sort of sharp elbows and opinions, so did Justice Scalia. They both had sharp elbows. But to her credit, Justice Sotomayor has come out recently to defend Justice Thomas, who has been the subject of, in my view, outrageous attacks, to talk about what he's like as a colleague. Justice Breyer has pushed back on arguments that the court is even conservative. He said the court's not conservative. And in fact, even though that almost is impossible to imagine when you read the coverage, it's because there's a complete disconnect between coverage and reality. The vast majority of cases in the Supreme Court are unanimous or near unanimous, or they have a mix from the left or right. Very few fit this model of this hard left-right division. Now, that is common in certain areas, right, where those ideological differences are going to be sort of baked in, where you have things like Dobbs and Roe v. Wade. But if you look at this week, for example, the majority of cases were unanimous or 7-2. And by the way, the two were not always two liberals. They were a mix. So what I think Breyer is trying to say is that people have this wrong idea that the Supreme Court is robotically and dysfunctionally ideological. It's not. So how is the court then going to go through this period? And I have to say, I don't think we've had a period since the Marshall period, and I would say the Earl Warren period, where the court has been under greater attack. But I actually think this exceeds the Earl Warren period. With Earl Warren, there was just a move to impeach him. A lot of people didn't like the desegregation rulings. But we never have had anything like this. So you start with the leak. And the leak is something that we all need to sort of think about, not because of the specific draft itself. We will be finding out today or probably Friday what Dobbs is now, and whether Alito is still the author of that opinion. But the leak is more interesting is what it says about us. There's a reason why this is unheard of in history of the court. Think about it. Washington is a city that floats on leaks. Leaks are our currency. It is a powerful commodity that is used by people in both parties. And yet there's always been one island that didn't leak. The Supreme Court, the one with the smallest security force, the least number of restrictions. There have been leaks. Roe v. Wade actually was leaked. A lot of people don't remember that, but Roe v. Wade there were actually two leaks that came out with Roe. One was just accidental. The opinion was supposed to come out in the morning. A draft was released, and they were like, whoa, we actually haven't released that yet. But you can count on one hand the number of true leaks. There's often scuttlebutt that gets out, books that are written. But anyone will tell you that the Supreme Court doesn't leak. So the question is why? We've had divided courts. We've had terribly divided courts. And yet leaks didn't occur. And the reason is because they had this common article of faith in the institution of the Supreme Court, They believed in it. But more importantly, they identified with it. They became part of it. And I'm speaking of the clerks. So what has changed? Why now? Why would someone commit the greatest sin you can commit on the court, which is to break that tradition of confidentiality and trust? And the answer is that we have a rising generation that has been told to doubt core values, to put outcome determinative results ahead of principle. Now, I'm not blaming you. Yes, I am. No, I'm not blaming you. I'm actually blaming my generation. That is, if you go to universities today, it gets hammered over and over and over again that our values are, privileged and manufactured and dishonest. Well, they're not. Civility, integrity, those aren't manufactured values. So whoever leaked this decided that they would completely unmoor themselves from everything that defines the court and themselves. Now you go from that event that then triggered these protests at the homes of justices. Now, I've disagreed with a lot of people about those protests. I do not believe that the federal law could be used to arrest those protesters. I just don't agree. I think a court would narrowly construe the law because there is a right to protest. But there's a difference between whether something is worthy of criminalization and whether something is worthy of condemnation. What's happening in front of these houses is worthy of condemnation of both parties, regardless of how you feel about Roe. You're trying to harass and intimidate jurists simply because they don't agree with your interpretation of the law. I feel the same way of what we saw in the hearing yesterday with January 6th. In hearing the testimony of the Speaker of the Arizona House, to hear the testimony of that woman who was a poll watcher, who was called out by name by the president, who had to go into hiding. Her mother had to leave her home. Her grandmother found people pounding on her door saying that they wanted to do a citizen's arrest of an 80-year-old grandmother. What's false about our coverage is that we divide the world into left and right. But these are the same people. The same people at that grandmother's house are the same people at Justice Amy Coney Barrett's house yesterday that covered themselves in blood and dropped babies in front of a house where she has 7 children, including young children. They're the same people. They just have different values, right? They're decoupled. They're floating. They have no core values except this one issue. But the issue is not abortion. I'm sorry. They're addicted to rage, and they won't admit it. And they won't admit that they enjoy it. Just like those people that went to that grandmother's house involving Georgia. Anyone who knocks on a grandmother's door and says, I'm here to do a citizen's arrest, is addicted to rage. They have nothing but rage left. So the question then is, how do we fill that vacuum that rage has now occupied for so long? And the answer is here. The answer is you. You're here for a reason, right? I don't want to butter your toast, but it took a lot to get here. It even took a lot for Senator Paul to get here. But you're here for a reason because you all share one thing in common. You believe you could make a difference, and you also believe that you have skin in the game. That's what, and of course I always have to bring up Madison every 3 minutes. That's what the genius of James Madison really was. Because James Madison didn't invent the separation of powers, didn't invent this Article 1 through 3 structure. Montesquieu and the French could probably claim that distinction. But like most things, we didn't invent it, we just stole it and made it better. And that's what Madison did. You see, the problem with previous systems is that they were all based on a common affirmation of values, what we have in common, right? If you come up to me, and please don't do this, after the speech and say, I love the Constitution, I read it daily, then I'm going to have to say, I don't believe you. My students tell me that, and I say, I don't believe you. The United States Constitution is not a beautiful thing. It was written by a geek, the ultimate wonk, okay? Nobody reads the U.S. Constitution and says, tears were soaking through my shirt, right? If you want to read poetry in motion, read any of the French constitutions, and you can choose because so many of them failed. But those constitutions, man, the French know how to write a constitution. They talk about the rights of man, the horizon of humanity, marching together to that rising sun. And it's amazing. And then you have a revolution, which they did on a weekly basis. And then they throw a party, which only the French can really do. And then they wake up the next morning and they're like, oh, you're not quite the person I thought you were. And the reason is because the last conversation you had was all the things you had in common. Of course, you fell in love before the revolution. It's after the revolution that you get sort of stuck in that marriage. Madison realized that the thing that destroyed governments is factions. And they're factions that are left below the surface, that fester and explode. So he created a system, unlike France, that exploded outward. He created a system that imploded, that exploded towards the center, which is Article 1. So that everyone has skin in the game. That's why you're here. You know that this is the place, if you want to change the world, you can change the world. Together, whether you agree or not. So when we talk about filling that void that rage now occupies, it is whatever brought you here. Whether you're conservative, liberal, Democrat, or Republican, whatever brought you here is what has to fill that void. But then you have to proselytize. Because this is all going to be yours, not that long from now. This whole place is going to be yours. And you need allies on the left and the right. And that's the reason I think it's so important to talk to you on days like this, the bad days. When people of like mind can get together and say enough. Enough of the rage, enough of the addiction. Whatever happens tomorrow or Friday with Roe v. Wade will happen. And then the system that we all have an investment in can be used to make it right according to what you think should be done. But we all have an interest in that system. We all have an interest in that court. And maybe that interest just might be the thing that'll get us through this age of rage. Why don't I stop there, and then if you want to ask any questions, including salacious questions about the framers, which I specialize on. Oh boy, your hand went right up when I said salacious questions about the framers. Any question involving Benjamin Franklin is by definition salacious. Of course.
First off, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. I'm Rami Daham. I'm from Buffalo, New York with the TFAS program. I have a question for you about originalism versus living theory. When it comes down to the Constitution, you mentioned that it's for the worst times that we do use it. Do you recommend that, in your opinion, do we look at it through an originalism view or through the living document view? And how does that play into your argument against rage?
You know, I have generally gotten more textualist with age. I'm socially quite liberal. My politics is fairly liberal, but I tend to be very conservative when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. And I tend to be more libertarian than liberal. I was ruined by this man's father. I said coming over here, never have lunch with Ron Paul, you'll end up a libertarian. So I don't like the living Constitution because, quite frankly, I just don't find it, I don't see the limiting principles of the living Constitution. So I tend to favor the text. I don't think there's anyone who is truly a pure originalist on the court. Thomas comes pretty darn close. But most people are textualist. and intentionalists rather than originalists, but that the difference can be slight. When you look at the styles of these justices, the most liberal constitution sort of approach is you find that with Sotomayor. And what I tell people who are always angry at one side or the other, because everyone always says, can you believe those ideologues? And I just wait to see which side they're talking about. Including, I testified at the confirmation in favor of Gorsuch's confirmation. I remember, I think it was Senator Whitehouse saying, how can you say that these conservatives are not this cabal, locked in cabal, 5-4, 5-4, 5, and he's reading all these things. And I said, Senator, you're forgetting the 4 on the other side. They're always voting together, but for some reason the 5 are the robotic ideologues. I mean, the fact is that these people really try to get it right. They really do. I respect Justice Sotomayor. I respect Justice Kagan. I respect that they are not political ideologues. They're following a philosophy, and you want them to be consistent, right? You don't want them just to float around to get the outcome. That's the reason I like Scalia. He had the most consistent, clear philosophy on the court. And so I think you'll find that on those questions, you're going to see more of that division that you just talked about between the two.
Hi, I'm Ari. I'm from north of Chicago. I go to George Washington University.
Oh, yeah, and I'm from Chicago.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. We're in north side Chicago. Where are you?
Evanston.
Evanston, okay. Good.
Yeah. How has tension, I've seen it in the university itself as well, has tension in terms of the student body changed the way you either teach or changed the way you think about style in the classroom?
Well, it doesn't change my style in the classroom just because I'm ornery and have a death wish. But it's only a matter of time before I'm unemployed. But it has changed, and it's very, very sad. Teaching has always been a very liberal profession. But most top law schools today have a maximum of 2 or 3 Republicans, maybe 5 or 6 conservatives, libertarians on faculties that are over 100. My faculty is no exception to that rule. And there has been a rising intolerance across the country. And the few conservatives, Republicans that remain, find themselves continually hit with complaints, investigations, and many of them are retiring. Some of them are being forced out. A good example is what happened to Shapiro at Georgetown. With that, he wrote a dumb tweet. But, I have a blog that follows these free speech controversies. And if you go on that blog, you'll see dozens of tweets from liberal faculty, including the ones saying we should kill Republicans. These are direct quotes. We should blow Republicans up. Supporting the murder of conservative protesters. Those are all professors. One professor in California actually physically assaulted a pro-life display with students. She pled guilty to criminal assault. She was supported by the faculty. When I got tenure, I vaguely remember the rule, thou shalt not assault thy students. It's a long time ago, but I thought that was the rule. But nothing happened. So then you have someone like Shapiro, who writes the world's dumbest tweet, which is not a distinction that any of us can claim to be on the other side of. He withdrew it. He apologized for it. So they put him on suspension for 4 months, and then they say you can come back, but then they basically say, if you had started just a little earlier, we would have fired you. And so he resigned. Because for conservative faculty, it's like having a police officer in your rearview mirror going down the driveway, going down the highway every minute of the day to see if you go 1 mile over 55. And then you get pulled over. That's the environment that we're in. And so the few of us that are remaining who are dissenting voices are trying to find ways to deal with this. I have a piece coming out in one of the Harvard journals suggesting ways that we might be able to combat this. But it's gotten to be pretty bad. Do you want to pick someone? I don't know if I have the right to choose, okay?
Hello. My name is Kate. Thank you for coming and chatting with us today. So I have two questions. My first is looking deeper into the rage. If you want to distinguish between rage and other individuals that believe they are exercising their constitutional law because it's driven by their morals and by their beliefs, how do you distinguish that? And then if you, which I do agree, there is an extent to where there is rage, and if we do define it as rage, then what's happening at justices' doors and what's happening during January 6th on the Capitol, the attack on the Capitol, what is the solution for that? So other than just identifying the problem and saying we should stop, how do we stop individuals, whether that's misinformation or technology or educating individuals, what are your recommendations?
No, it's a great question. I actually have a follow-up I'm working on now to the Harvard piece called The Right to Rage. And as someone who hates the age of rage, I do believe it's constitutionally protected. I also am wholeheartedly against censorship on social media. I'm against with these policies at Twitter, Facebook. I think that we are getting dangerously close to criminalizing hate speech in this country, and I don't think that's a good idea. Because if you look in Europe, you'll see what's awaiting us if we get on that slippery slope. I mean, Europe has been prosecuting speech for decades, and free speech isn't a free fall. And I hope we don't cross that Rubicon. What we can do is that the distinction between January 6th and what's happening at the Justice House, I think that the protests at the Justice House are disgusting, but they're lawful. Those are constitutional protests. What happened on January 6th was a riot. It was not lawful. And everyone who rioted, anyone who went into the building without authority has a right to be, charged. I don't agree with how the Justice Department has handled a lot of those cases. Some of those cases of people walking in and they're still being, charged and prosecuted over unlawful entry, I think is a little excessive, but that's the price you pay if you walk into a building like that in the middle of a riot. But I think we can make distinctions. I'm someone who believes that I probably have the farthest view of free speech of anyone I know. I've been called a free speech absolutist. At one time, that was actually a compliment. But it is a title that I still readily embrace. I reject most limitations on free speech. I don't believe speech is harmful. And that's the new pitch at universities. I'm a big believer in John Stuart Mill. And I think that the harm principle is key here. This is what the Harvard piece is on. That speech itself is not harm. It is not something that the government should be able to regulate and criminalize. Unless it is speech that causes concrete harm. Like if you have a criminal conspiracy to murder, obviously it's speech, but it's part of an act. And that's a distinction, is action. So that would be my suggestion. Should we go over here to spread it out? My students complain that I always pick right in front of me, and that's a...
Thank you, sir. It's Bence Szabó from Hungary and Europe, and I can confirm that the tendencies that we have in our continent is quite troubling.
Did you say Hungary?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
My country is also another topic, but that's not for today. One of the interesting things for me with the Constitution is that the Hungarian Constitution is not cartel, it's historic, and that's what we try to refer to whenever we have issues with the European Union. Because we live in an age in the EU where there is a strong drive for European law supremacy against nation states' legal supremacy. My question for you would be, what are the elements of your almost 300-year-old Constitution that still stands the test of time? And what amendments could be subject for change in the future, given the fact that society or legal scholars would deem it not worthy of the current times?
Wow, that I could get a PhD on that one. The answer of what distinguishes the U.S. Constitution, I touched on a little bit earlier, in that the most unique aspect of the U.S. Constitution is it forces our divisions to the surface. It forces them, it basically starts a fight in Congress. And the division of constituencies makes that fight even more severe. That's what the genius of Madison was. I remember one time I testified 30 years ago, and a House member was proposing that they should change the Constitution so that House members are elected every 4 years. And he said, you know, Professor, you've got to admit that in today's modern politics, 2 years is ridiculous. It worked with the framers. It doesn't work with us. And he says, we're just miserable. All we do is campaign. And I said, I'm not too sure we're going to agree on this. You were supposed to be miserable. That was the design. You're supposed to be a nervous wreck. That's what the House is. You're supposed to be afraid of insulting anyone. You're supposed to be running back and forth to make sure you're not insulting anyone, right? Because you're the nervous wrecks, and you pass stuff first. That's why you're the people's house. And by the way, your predecessors had to get into a horse and in carriage and go to places like Kentucky. So don't complain that this was such a hardship. And then, of course, once you have these nervous wrecks pass things like that, right? That's why the House always, something is in the New York Times the next day, we have a new bill, right? And then it goes to the Senate, where it faces people like this, exactly, who are constitutionally designed not to be nervous. Right? They're constitutionally supposed to be slumbering so that when the House comes to them and says, we need something right away, Senator Paul looks at his watch and says, maybe not right away. Okay? And so in that mix, you then come out with factional interests, coming out with a majoritarian compromise, eventually passes the Senate, and goes to the only person with a national constituency, the President of the United States. As mechanical as that sounds, it was brilliant, because it diffuses these tensions, but it forces majoritarian compromise out of factional interests. That's the one thing that we've succeeded at. We don't have a beautiful system. The Madisonian system is basically an all-terrain vehicle. It's designed to last, not to inspire, right? And it has. We've gone through periods that have reduced other countries to a fine pumice, but we're still here. And it's because of that division. The other key here, and this is probably the most important thing to replicate in other countries, is that the framers were against the concentration of power in any one branch or any one person. That was the overriding principle of the Madisonian system. No branch has the power to govern alone. And the courts are invested with the power to keep people's hands on their own plates. Now, there's challenges to that. The rise of what's called the fourth branch in federal agencies has challenged that. But I would simply note that I was doing some research on Madison at Princeton, looking at some of his papers. And what was really striking to me was in his writings as an undergrad, as a college student, were astonishing. And by the way, you really have to hate the guy. I mean, because in his freshman year, he developed this universe of planets on this piece of paper that had like 2,000 planets and stars. Because the hottest thing back then was Newtonian physics. And so he was fascinated by how gravity kept planets in check. And you look, when I saw this thing, and knowing that he spoke 3 languages when he went to college, including Latin, you just had to say, God, I hate this guy. He's exactly the guy I hated in undergrad. Talking about the ultimate curve breaker. But what's amazing, though, about it is that when you then look at his statements in the Constitutional Convention, those Newtonian terms come out. He viewed the 3 branches as locked in an orbit, like that gravitational pull, that was a stable orbit because they were equal heavenly bodies. The only time you risk instability is when any one branch grows in size. That's the danger of the rise of the fourth branch. First of all, it's an extra branch in a 3-branch system, but also it throws off that balance, and that's a concern. Back there? Sure.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for being here with us. My name's Forrest. I'm from Ohio. I study at Princeton, and this last semester I was able to take constitutional interpretation under Professor Robert George. And this was the first experience while at Princeton where my own deeply held beliefs were challenge. I analyzed them under rigorous scrutiny, and we had incredibly passionate debate in the classroom. It was the perfect learning environment. I'm wondering how we can shore up more support for that in undergraduate institutions, how the student body and the faculty can both encourage individuals to argue with one another, to passionately disagree, and for this to be done civilly, because in the other academic settings, it's not nearly as open or as accepted.
It's a great question. Princeton actually has a fairly good record in terms of free speech. There is, however, a recent controversy at Princeton of a teacher who was fired, and I think that they lost a lot of that protection with that teacher. And most of us believe he was fired because of his views. They essentially went back and dug up a case that had already been adjudicated. He had already been punished for it and decided to then say you're fired for that. And that was after he was cleared over the controversy involving his speech. My second bone to pick with Princeton is last time I spoke there, as an honor, instead of putting me at that wonderful hotel, it's a 5-star hotel across from the campus, they said, we have a special thing, you'll be staying in the room that James Madison slept in. And it's the longest night of my life because Madison was that tall and there's no air conditioning. And so I love Madison, but not that much. So, the answer to your question is that some schools are better than others. The gold standard is the University of Chicago, where I went. The Chicago letter is now the standard letter being used by Purdue, a number of other universities. And it started with the world's greatest acceptance letter in the history of humanity. When the president of University of Chicago wrote all the accepted U Chicago students and said, congratulations being accepted at U Chicago. For those of you who are concerned that you may feel threatened and that with some of the views that other people have and you would like to confirm that we have safe spaces, I just want to assure you, we do not. And this should weigh in your decision as to whether you want to come here or not, but we do not restrict free speech at the University of Chicago. There are no safe spaces from speech. And that letter, the principle of that letter has been replicated, but by very few universities. The problem is that there's very few dissenting voices on faculties. And in fact, free speech now is under fire. I truly am a dinosaur when it comes to free speech. My views on the robust views on free speech, there's maybe a handful of us that still utter those views. Most free speech academics today are writing on limiting free speech. Free speech is harm. Polls have shown that conservative students are about 10 times more likely to not speak on campus because they feel that they will be docked, they will be held accountable for their views. I can tell you, faculty feel the same way. I was really sad in this last term when a student came to me, she was in my Supreme Court class, and she said, she said, I just want you to know that your class was the first class I have had in undergrad or in grad school where I actually felt I could share my views. And she said, I'm not saying that to complain. I'm just saying that so you should be aware that it was in my last class in graduate school that I actually had a class that I felt safe to talk about being conservative, about conservative views. And it made me almost want to weep because I never thought we would get to this point in our educational system. It's again going to fall on you because my generation's made a mess of it. But you're going to have to be bold. You're going to have to trust us to defend you. I know it's going to be hard, but life is not like a Monopoly game. You don't go around as many times as you want. You go around once. So you might as well fight for the good fight. Live it the way you want to live and speak the way you want to speak. Let's go here. My students also complain. They've actually come to me because they said, not only do you pick immediately in front of you, you always pick to the right. And then I realized that all of my classes, everyone sits to the right.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak. I really enjoyed and got a lot out of it. My name is Bethany. I'm from Southern California. I'm definitely a political minority in that case. And so I really appreciate how much you speak about free speech. And so I guess my question was, for someone who wants to pursue a career in the justice system and is currently at a school that very much limits free speech, and but this is something that I'm passionate about, do you have any advice for how I could approach that individually, just because I don't have a group to kind of fight with me? But yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know what's funny is when I was first asked this question is when I first started teaching at Tulane, and I wanted to get a critical legal studies scholar on the faculty. And I found one. She was a feminist critical legal studies scholar. And she said, you know, should I present my critical legal studies paper? And I said, no. I said, do the property paper. Get on the faculty. And I didn't like saying that, but I really wanted to see that diversity. It's funny now that we're facing intolerance from the extreme left. That is, you know, you've got TLS people saying you can't bring in a conservative, and they have a code, right? They say, well, this person's views are not rigorous enough, or we don't have enough people that agree with this. Well, of course you don't. There's no conservative or dissenting voices on your faculty. So my advice to you is to be bold, but to be cautious. For dissenters, libertarians, conservatives, the fact is you don't have as much of room for error. You will not get the support of the university. You'll get the support of individual faculty. But you're not without support. And I got to tell you something else. I have noticed a change among young people particularly. I think that some of the people that are limiting free speech on campus get the students wrong, particularly your generation. Your generation is very skeptical. My son's here, I can tell you, he's disgustingly skeptical. But the very interesting thing is I blog early in the morning around 5, and I remember a few years ago, one of my sons, I think it was Ben, came down and asked, what are you blogging on? And I said, this bizarre story, blah, 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 blah. And he says, well, that's interesting, but is it true? And I said, what do you mean it's true? It's in such and such a paper. This must have been like 10 years ago. And he says, yeah, but is it true? And it occurred to me that when I grew up, if it was in the New York Times or if Walter Cronkite said it, it was true. You could take it to the bank. None of my children believe that anymore. And that's a good and a bad thing, because we do have a lot of bias in the media. So you have to be skeptical. But your generation is far more skeptical. And I think that's going to work to the advantage of free speech. I think that you know, as hard as it is to defend free speech as an abstraction, free speech also, there's one problem with those people who are trying to limit free speech on campuses and in society and to censor it on social media. Free speech is like water. It tends to get out. And also, some of us, and I'm a real minority on this one, believe that free speech is a normative right, a human right. And the reason we believe it's a human right is because I don't think you can be entirely human without it. And so what you're asking people to do, people have never willingly done, to stay quiet and conform to the views of others. So I have faith. I still do. So be bold, just be cautious. There's always power in numbers. Yeah.
This will be our last one.
Our last one. Oh, this puts me, then you pick. I can't do this. It's like Sophie's Choice.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak with us today. My name is Anna Spear, and I'm from Wyoming. And I'm going to kind of draw it back to your explanation of rage, but I'm wondering how you explain it within a legal context when we have very palpable social issues today, like systematic racism and minority oppression. Is this an issue that is wrongfully being placed on the Supreme Court, or is this something that we should be taking up with Congress?
Well, what do you mean placed on the Supreme Court?
As in, I feel as though today when we have cases like Roe v. Wade or things like that where we have, say, like many women will believe that they're being oppressed through the overturning of the case. Is this an issue that shouldn't necessarily be protested towards like the Supreme Court? And that you mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court is like, they're giving their interpretation of the law. And should we be placing blame on the Supreme Court or on the actual makers of the law?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, rage can be a good thing if rage means passion, right? Rage can be a good thing if rage means activism and advocacy. Rage is good because it shows that you believe so much in your values that you are upset by their denial. It is the expression of rage that we really have to deal with. I have no problem with people protesting at the Supreme Court. That's a good thing. It's a good thing for people to express it. And also, Roe v. Wade is a big deal for women. And you can disagree on it, but it's a big deal. You should feel passionately about it. Now, does protesting the Supreme Court help in that? To be honest, no. Right? I mean, protesting in front of the Supreme Court, no. I mean, it's like trying to, stop a storm by yelling at it. It's not going to register because these are people that are, to their credit, motivated by their interpretation of the law. And if anything, if you shove them, they're more likely to dig in, which is exactly how stupid the things going on at these houses would be. But protests are a good thing. And when it comes to Roe v. Wade, what we're lacking in rage is reason, right? The problem with rage is when there's no longer capacity for reason. This demonization, if you don't agree with the interpretation of Roe v. Wade, you must be anti-women or you must be anti-feminist. Putting aside that there's a vast number of women who are pro-life. Now, what's ignored there is that even Lawrence Tribe, when Roe came out, said that it was a smokescreen and that he didn't agree with the analysis. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that she did not agree with the way Roe was written. And by the way, Roe died with Casey. Roe doesn't even exist anymore because the Supreme Court gutted Roe and replaced it with Casey. But we don't have any capacity anymore to have that conversation. We don't have the capacity to say, no, whatever happens tomorrow or Friday or Monday, abortion is not going to be illegal in the United States. In the vast majority of states, it will be legal, and we will then have to fight state by state. What's interesting is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg told the Harvard students years ago, she said, it was probably a mistake. We went too far. She said, before Roe v. Wade, the number of pro-choice states was increasing. The minute Roe v. Wade came down, we lost ground politically. And that's a very common complaint among justices, that when the Supreme Court intervenes on something like this, it can change the political dynamic. So what will happen is that we can show that passion, and you can fight to protect abortion rights, or you can fight to protect pro-life values, and we will have that debate as citizens. But it is possible, even today, that we could actually have that debate and respect each other. Because I totally get both sides. I actually have friends on both sides. I get the pro-choice view, I get the pro-life view. To me, they're not horrible people, and yet they're being pushed so that they have to demonize the other side. And I think that's the capacity that we've lost that we have to regain. Thank you very much. It was great seeing you.